Why I stayed silent for 20 years. But no one knew what really happened. I thought time would heal this. Some stories are too heavy to tell, but I lost everything, then found myself. And this was never meant to be heard. This is not just a story. This is the journey of a woman who carried 20 years of pain in silence. Tonight, let me tell you a story that took 20 years to be spoken. Let's start. The park was quieter than it usually was at this hour. Not silent, never completely silent, but softened. As if the world itself had decided to speak more gently today. Leaves shifted lazily in the trees above, brushing against one another, with a faint, papery whisper. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, and then stopped. The sound of traffic existed only as a dull hum, far enough away to feel unreal, like a memory instead of a present moment. I stood at the edge of the walking path, my hands tucked into the pockets of my sweater, breathing in air that smelled faintly of damp earth and early autumn. This park had always felt like a place meant for pauses. Not beginnings, not endings, pauses. I had come here many times over the years, sometimes with purpose, sometimes without, but today felt different. Today, my feet had carried me here without asking permission from my mind, as if some quieter part of me had already decided that this was where I needed to be. I took a slow step forward. The gravel beneath my shoes crunched softly, grounding me in the moment. With each step, I felt the weight of the day settle more comfortably on my shoulders, as though the trees themselves were willing to carry some of it for me. I walked slowly, deliberately, allowing space between each step. There was no rush. There hadn't been a rush for a long time now. As I moved deeper into the park, memories began to stir. Not sharply, not painfully, but gently. The way they sometimes do when you finally stop moving long enough to hear them. I noticed a bench to my right, weathered and familiar. I had sat there once before, or maybe many times. The details blurred together now, but the feeling remained. A quiet companionship between wood, metal, and thought. I didn't sit down, not yet. Instead, I continued walking, letting the path guide me the way it always had. The trees grew taller here, their branches arching overhead like an unfinished cathedral. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in scattered patches, warming my face for brief moments before disappearing again. I closed my eyes for just a second. In that brief darkness, something shifted. A memory surfaced, not a specific moment, but an emotion. The familiar ache of standing on the edge of something unknown. The feeling of having lived a long life already, and still not being entirely sure where it had gone. I opened my eyes again. The path stretched ahead, curving gently to the left, disappearing behind a cluster of trees. I wondered how many times I had walked this same curve, lost in thought, unaware of how much time had passed. Time had a strange way of behaving in places like this. Sometimes it rushed forward, dragging you along with it. Other times it lingered, waiting patiently for you to catch up. I slowed my pace even more, allowing the rhythm of my breathing to settle into something steady and familiar. Inhale, exhale. The simple act felt grounding, almost ceremonial. I realized then that I wasn't here to walk. I was here to remember. The realization didn't arrive with drama or intensity. It came quietly, the way most truths do, when they finally decide to reveal themselves. I had spent years avoiding this kind of stillness. Years filling my days with noise, conversations, responsibilities, routines. Anything that kept me moving forward without asking too many questions. But movement has a way of hiding things. Stillness does not. Stillness reveals. As I passed beneath a particularly tall oak, I noticed how its trunk was marked with deep grooves, scars left by decades of weather and time. I found myself wondering how old it was, how many seasons it had witnessed without ever needing to explain itself. There was something comforting about that. The idea that you could stand in one place for so long, changing quietly, without ever having to justify who you were becoming. I reached the center of the park, where the path opened into a small clearing. The space felt intentional, as though it had been designed for moments like this. Moments when a person needed room to think without feeling exposed. I stopped walking. The world continued around me, indifferent, yet kind. Leaves fell. Birds moved unseen. Somewhere, life went on exactly as it always had. And yet, something inside me had paused. I let my thoughts drift, unstructured and unguarded. Memories rose and fell, without insisting on attention. Faces appeared, softened by time. Voices echoed faintly, their words long since absorbed into something less defined. I thought about the versions of myself that had passed through this same park years ago. The woman who had once walked here with a restless urgency, always checking the time. The woman who had come here seeking answers, convinced they would appear if she waited long enough. The woman who had sat on that bench with tears she hadn't known how to name. All of them felt close and distant. I wondered which version I was now. The question lingered, unanswered, and I found that I didn't mind. There was a strange comfort in not needing immediate clarity, in allowing the question to exist without demanding resolution. A breeze moved through the clearing, brushing against my sleeves, carrying with it the faint scent of fallen leaves and cool earth. I pulled my sweater closer, not because I was cold, but because the gesture felt grounding, a reminder of the body I inhabited, the present moment I was standing in. I realized then that this story, whatever it was becoming, wasn't about a single moment. It was about accumulation, about all the small, quiet experiences that layered themselves over time, shaping a life in ways that were only visible when you finally stopped to look back. I took another breath. The park felt like a threshold. Behind me lay years of movement, of decisions made quickly and sometimes without reflection. Ahead lay something slower, quieter, and perhaps more honest. I didn't know yet what memories would surface next. I only knew that I was ready to listen, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The house stood quietly at the edge of town, just as it always had. Not abandoned, not forgotten, just waiting. Evelyn had not seen it in over 20 years, yet the moment her car slowed at the curb, recognition settled into her chest like a familiar ache. The pale siding had faded further with time, and the old maple tree leaned a little more than it once had. But the shape of the place remained unchanged, steady, patient, almost kind. She turned off the engine but stayed seated, hands resting on the steering wheel. The silence felt heavy, broken only by the distant sound of wind brushing through leaves. For a long moment she did nothing at all. Returning had not been part of her plan, at least not consciously. Life had a way of circling back when you least expected it to. And now here she was, drawn by a letter written in careful handwriting, by words that felt both distant and deeply personal. The house is still yours, if you want it. The sentence echoed in her thoughts as she finally opened the car door. Cool air brushed her face, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and old wood. Autumn had arrived early this year, painting the neighborhood in muted golds and browns. It suited the moment. Evelyn stepped onto the sidewalk, her movements slow, deliberate. Each step toward the house felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself remembered her footsteps. The front porch creaked softly under her weight. That sound, that exact sound, stirred something inside her. It had always done that, even when she was young. Some things, it seemed, never changed. She rested her hand against the doorframe, fingers tracing the familiar grooves in the wood. Time had deepened them, but they were unmistakable. This was the place where she had grown into herself, piece by fragile piece, where laughter had once filled the rooms, where silence had later taken its place. When she opened the door, the air inside greeted her like an old breath held too long. Dust drifted through slanted light, dancing gently in the quiet. The house smelled of aged paper, cedar, and something softer beneath it. Memory, perhaps. The furniture remained, covered in pale sheets that sagged with time. Nothing had been moved, nothing disturbed. It felt less like entering a building and more like stepping into a paused moment. Evelyn moved slowly through the entryway, her footsteps muffled by the rug that had once been carefully vacuumed every Saturday morning. She remembered that ritual clearly. Her mother believed order brought peace. Her father believed in letting life be messy. Somewhere between those two ideas, Evelyn had learned how to survive. She paused in the living room, her eyes drawn to the fireplace. It had always been the heart of the house, the place where stories were told, where winter evenings stretched long and warm. She could almost hear the echo of her father's voice, low and steady, telling stories that wandered without destination. She hadn't realized how much she missed that sound until now. Evelyn sat on the edge of the old sofa, the fabric sighing softly beneath her. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, but she did not fight it. She had learned, over the years, that resisting memory only made it sharper. Instead, she let it come. She remembered the last winter she spent here, how the house had felt different then, quieter, heavier, how conversations had grown shorter and goodbyes lingered without being spoken. She had been older by then, old enough to recognize change, but too young to understand how permanent it could be. Leaving had felt necessary at the time. Staying had felt impossible. She rose and moved toward the hallway, where photographs still lined the wall. Faces stared back at her, frozen smiles, captured moments of joy. She recognized herself in them, though the woman she had become felt far removed from the girl in those frames. At the end of the hall, her old bedroom waited. The door opened easily as though it had been expecting her. Inside, the room was smaller than she remembered, but no less significant. Pale curtains filtered the afternoon light, casting soft patterns across the floor. The bed remained neatly made, the quilt folded with care. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled slowly. This room had held her dreams once. It had witnessed her doubts, her quiet resolve, her whispered plans for a life beyond these walls. It had been both sanctuary and cage, depending on the day. She wondered, briefly, who she might have been if she had stayed. The thought lingered, unresolved. From the bedroom window, she could see the backyard stretching out behind the house. The grass had grown wild in places, the fence weathered but standing. Beyond it, the trees formed a familiar boundary, a line she had crossed many times as a child, always believing the world beyond was larger, brighter. She had been right about that. But standing here now, she understood something she hadn't before. Leaving did not erase what came before. It only layered life on top of it. Evelyn rose and returned to the living room, where the late afternoon light had begun to soften. She stood near the fireplace, her reflection faint in the darkened glass. The woman looking back at her was older, yes, marked by years and choices. But there was strength there too, a quiet steadiness she had earned. She reached into her bag and removed the letter once more, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was still familiar, careful, measured, honest. "You don't have to decide today," it read, "but I thought you should know. Some things are meant to be returned to." Evelyn folded the letter again and held it close. The house did not ask anything of her. It did not demand answers or promises. It simply stood, offering space for memory, for reflection, for choice. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched gently across the floor. Evelyn lit a small lamp, its warm glow filling the room. The light felt right, intentional. For the first time since arriving, she smiled. Not out of nostalgia, but understanding. This was not about reclaiming the past. It was about acknowledging it. The house had remembered her. Now she was remembering herself. And somewhere in that quiet recognition, a new chapter, unspoken but unmistakable, began to form. The house had been quiet for so long that silence felt like part of its structure. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the heavy kind. The kind that settles into corners, that presses against walls, that lingers in rooms long after voices have gone. For years, every sound inside that house had been measured. Footsteps were careful. Doors were closed softly. Even breathing felt restrained, as though the walls themselves were listening. She hadn't noticed when it started. Grief rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, settles in gently, and before you know it, it has rearranged your entire life. In the early days, the house had been full of movement. Friends stopping by, family bringing food, conversations drifting through hallways late into the evening. But time moved forward, as it always does, and one by one, those visits faded. What remained was her, the house, and the echo of what once was. She learned the patterns of silence the way others learn routines. Morning silence, afternoon silence, evening silence. Each had its own texture. In the mornings, light slipped through the curtains and rested quietly on the floor, as if unsure whether it was welcome. She would stand in the kitchen, coffee growing cold in her hands, listening to the hum of the refrigerator just to remind herself that something else existed in the room. Afternoons stretched endlessly. The ticking clock became louder, more demanding. She sometimes turned on the radio, not to listen, but to keep the silence from swallowing the house whole. Evenings were the hardest. Shadows grew longer, memories louder. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something that never arrived. For a long time, She believed the house was grieving with her. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. It started with a window. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, she noticed the air felt stale. The room smelled old, untouched. Without thinking too much about it, she walked over and lifted the window an inch, just enough to let air in. The sound surprised her. Leaves rustling, a distant car passing, the soft murmur of life continuing beyond her walls. She stood there longer than she intended, one hand resting on the window frame, letting the breeze brush past her face. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like healing, but it felt different. That night she slept with the window open. The next day, she opened another, and another. Soon, fresh air moved through the house, gently displacing the stillness. Curtains shifted, dust lifted and settled again. The house seemed to exhale for the first time in years. She didn't call it progress. She didn't label it as growth. She simply let it happen. Then came the small acts. One morning, she rearranged the living room chair, angling it toward the window instead of the television. It wasn't intentional. She just realized she wanted to look outside more than she wanted to watch another rerun of a show she wasn't really watching. She began sitting there in the afternoons, sunlight warming her hands, observing the world beyond the glass. People walked by. Dogs tugged at leashes. Seasons shifted slowly, deliberately. Life, it seemed, had not stopped just because hers had changed. The house noticed. It responded in subtle ways. Floors creaked more openly. The walls no longer felt heavy. Even the silence softened, becoming less oppressive, more spacious. One evening, she found herself humming while washing dishes. The sound startled her. She stopped, hands submerged in warm water, listening as the melody faded. It wasn't a song she recognized. It was something simple, instinctive, a sound that rose without permission. She didn't question it. She didn't analyze it. She simply allowed it. That night, she left a lamp on in the hallway, not because she needed the light, but because she liked how it made the house feel less empty. The house learned, slowly, how to hold light again. There were still difficult days when memories pressed in unexpectedly, days when she found an old photograph or heard a familiar song and felt the weight return to her chest. But now, the house no longer amplified those moments. Instead, it held them gently. She started opening the front door more often, standing on the porch, watching the sky change colors at dusk. Sometimes she spoke aloud, small observations, half-finished thoughts, just to hear her voice exist in space again. The sound no longer felt foreign. The house absorbed it, welcomed it. One afternoon, she brought home a plant. Just one. She placed it near the window, watered it carefully, adjusted its position until it caught the light just right. Caring for something living felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. As weeks passed, the plant grew, leaves unfurled, green replaced stillness. The house changed with it. Rooms felt warmer, corners less sharp. The silence transformed into something neutral, no longer an enemy, no longer a reminder, but simply the absence of noise. She realized then that the house had never been grieving. It had been waiting. Waiting for her to breathe again. Waiting for her to open windows. Waiting for her to bring life back inside. And she had. Not all at once. not dramatically, but gently, honestly, in ways that mattered. The house did not need laughter to feel alive again. It only needed presence. And now, when she walked through its rooms, her footsteps no longer echoed with loneliness. They echoed with belonging. The house had learned to breathe again. And so had she. There is a particular weight that ordinary days carry. It is not loud. It does not announce itself with pain or joy. It simply settles in quietly, like dust on a forgotten shelf. For Eleanor, those days had begun to blend together. Morning light entered her apartment through the same narrow window each day, landing on the same pale stretch of wall. She would wake before the alarm, lying still for a few moments, listening to the distant hum of traffic below. Somewhere outside, a bus exhaled at a stop. A door slammed. A dog barked once, then fell silent. Life was happening everywhere, just not loudly where she stood. She moved through her routine carefully, almost reverently. Coffee brewed. A single mug, always the same one. Toast browned just enough. The radio stayed off. Silence felt easier than choosing a sound. At work, Eleanor existed politely. She answered emails with precision. She nodded in meetings. She smiled when expected to. Her coworkers described her as reliable, calm, steady. They trusted her with details, deadlines, quiet responsibilities. No one asked how she was beyond the surface level. And she never offered more. There had been a time when she thought adulthood would feel fuller. Louder, maybe. More defined. Instead, it felt like standing in the middle of a wide field where nothing was technically wrong, but nothing was pulling her forward either. In the evenings, she walked. Not for exercise, not for health, just to feel motion. The park near her apartment became her regular path. Trees lined the walkway like silent witnesses, their branches arching overhead. Leaves crunched beneath her shoes in autumn, softened into damp silence after rain. She noticed small things. The way light filtered through branches, the rhythm of her own breathing. A changing scent of the air as seasons shifted. Somewhere along those walks, memories began to surface more often. Not dramatic memories, not moments of trauma or triumph, just fragments. A laugh from years ago, a kitchen table in another city, a voice that once spoke her name with certainty. She didn't chase those memories. She let them come and go like clouds drifting across the sky. But each one left a faint ache behind. At night, Eleanor sat by the window with a blanket pulled around her shoulders. The city glowed below, scattered with lights like distant stars. She wondered how many people were sitting exactly like this, awake, thoughtful, quietly questioning the shape of their own lives. She wondered if they felt this same low hum of restlessness. Not unhappiness, not contentment, something in between. She thought often about choice, about how life wasn't usually altered by big, dramatic decisions, but by the small ones we made without noticing. The turns we didn't take, the words we swallowed, the moments we let pass because they felt inconvenient or uncertain. Eleanor had been good at choosing safety. She had chosen stability over passion, predictability over risk, familiar paths over unknown roads. At the time, it had felt responsible, mature. Now, it felt quiet. On one particular evening, the park, felt different. The air carried a chill that hinted at winter's approach. The sky dimmed earlier than usual, shadows stretching long across the path. Eleanor slowed her steps, unsure why. Something in her chest felt tight, not painful, just heavy. She sat on a bench she had passed hundreds of times before. As she rested her hands in her lap, she noticed a small plaque on the bench's side. She had never seen it before, or maybe she simply hadn't looked closely enough. It read, "For those who pause, and for those who dare to begin again." The words stayed with her longer than she expected. Begin again. She had never thought of herself as someone who needed to begin again. That implied an ending, a failure, a dramatic collapse. But maybe beginnings didn't always require destruction. Maybe they started quietly. That night, Eleanor dreamed differently. Not vividly, not with clear images. Just a feeling. Movement. A sense of standing at the edge of something unnamed. When she woke, her heart felt strangely lighter. Over the following days, she noticed subtle shifts in herself. Small disruptions to routine. She chose a different path through the park, tried a new cafe instead of her usual stop, left her phone at home during evening walks. Each choice felt insignificant, but together, they created a quiet awareness. She began to feel present again. One afternoon, while walking, she noticed a woman sitting on a bench, sketching the trees. The woman looked up and smiled, a brief, gentle acknowledgement between strangers. Eleanor felt something stir inside her, a reminder that connection did not always require deep conversation. Sometimes it began with simply being seen. She returned home that evening and opened a notebook she hadn't touched in years. The first page was blank. She stared at it for a long time. Then she wrote one sentence. "I don't know what comes next, but I want to notice it." It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a promise, but it was honest. And honesty, she realized, was a beginning. As Eleanor closed the notebook, the city outside continued its steady rhythm. Cars passed. Lights flickered. Somewhere, someone laughed. Life moved forward, not urgently, not dramatically, but patiently. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt willing to move with it. The house stood at the end of the gravel road, the same way it always had, quiet, unassuming, and patient. Time had passed through it, but it had not erased it. The paint along the porch railings had faded into a pale memory of white, and the steps dipped slightly in the middle from decades of footsteps. A single oak tree leaned nearby. Its branches stretched wide as though it had once tried to shield the house from too much sun, too much rain, too much life. She stood at the edge of the yard for a long moment before moving closer. The grass was taller than she remembered, uneven and wild, bending beneath a soft breeze. With each step forward, the ground felt familiar beneath her shoes, as if her body remembered the path even when her mind hesitated. She hadn't planned on stopping here. Not really. The road had simply curved the way it always had, and somehow her hands had turned the steering wheel without asking permission. By the time she realized where she was, the house was already in view, waiting, as though it had known she would return. She exhaled slowly. The air smelled faintly of dry leaves and earth, the kind of scent that belonged to late afternoons and old places. Somewhere nearby, a bird called out, its sound lingering longer than expected. She climbed the porch steps carefully, the wood creaking beneath her weight. The sound startled her, not because it was loud, but because it was exactly the same. Some things never changed. The front door still bore the shallow scratch near the handle, the one no one ever admitted to making. She remembered tracing it with her finger years ago, wondering how something so small could remain when so much else disappeared. She reached out now and did the same. Her hand lingered there longer than necessary. Inside, the house greeted her with stillness. The air was cool and heavy, carrying the faint scent of dust and something older. Wood, fabric, memory. Light filtered through the front windows in long, narrow beams, catching particles in the air that drifted slowly, almost lazily. She closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing through the empty space. The living room was smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she was simply bigger now. The furniture was gone, but the shape of the room remained, etched into the walls and floor. She could still see where the couch had been, where the bookshelf once leaned slightly to the left. Even without the objects, their presence lingered, like impressions left behind after a long embrace. She walked slowly, letting her fingers skim along the wall. Every step stirred something inside her. A quiet remembering, a soft ache that wasn't painful enough to stop her, but not gentle enough to ignore. She paused near the window. Outside, the oak tree swayed gently, its leaves whispering to one another. She remembered sitting beneath it once. A rough bark against her back, the sky framed by branches overhead. She had believed then that the world was much larger than this place. Now, she wasn't so sure. The hallway stretched ahead of her, narrow and dim. The floorboards creaked here too, each sound rising and fading like a breath. She walked it slowly, as though moving too quickly might disturb something fragile. The first room on the left was empty, stripped down to bare walls and a single window. This had once been a bedroom. She stepped inside, standing near the center of the room, letting the silence settle around her. The sunlight spilled across the floor, warming one corner while leaving the rest in shadow. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the room filled itself. A bed against the wall, soft light in the early morning, the sound of someone moving in the kitchen down the hall, the quiet certainty that someone would always be there. Her eyes opened again. The room emptied just as quickly. She moved on. The second room felt heavier somehow, as though the air itself remembered more. She lingered here longer, unsure why. The walls seemed closer, the silence deeper. Some rooms held more than others. At the end of the hall, the kitchen waited. It was brighter than the rest of the house, sunlight pouring in through the window above the sink. The counter bore faint marks where years of use had worn the surface smooth in places. A single cabinet door hung slightly lower than the others, stubborn in its refusal to align. She smiled faintly at that. Some things, she realized, resisted correction. She stood in the center of the kitchen, listening, not for sounds, but for echoes. The room felt alive in a quiet way, as though it was holding its breath, aware of her presence. She imagined the past layered over the present, hands resting on the counter, the hum of conversation, the clink of dishes. Moments that once seemed ordinary but now felt impossibly distant. Time had a way of doing that, turning the simplest things into treasures only after they were gone. She leaned against the counter, closing her eyes again. Her chest tightened, just slightly, not from sadness alone, but from something deeper, a recognition. The understanding that this place had shaped her in ways she had never fully acknowledged. She straightened and took a slow breath. The house wasn't calling her back to stay. It was reminding her that she had been here, that her story did not begin elsewhere, no matter how far she had traveled since. She moved back toward the front room, her steps steadier now. At the doorway, she turned once more, taking in the space with new eyes. Not as someone returning to reclaim something lost, but as someone honoring what had been given. The house had held her once. That was enough. She stepped outside again, the late afternoon light wrapping around her like a familiar shawl. The oak tree rustled softly, its leaves catching the sun. As she walked back toward her car, she felt lighter, not because something had been resolved, but because something had been understood. Some places did not ask to be remembered loudly. They simply waited. A road into town curved gently, like it had learned patience over time. I drove slower than I needed to, my hands resting loosely on the steering wheel as familiar buildings came into view. Some had changed. Others hadn't changed at all, as if they were stubbornly holding on to the past on my behalf. The grocery store on the corner still had the same faded sign. The diner across the street still advertised pie in the window, though the lettering had peeled just a bit more since the last time I'd seen it. I noticed these details, not because they were important, but because noticing them helped me breathe. Returning always does that. It forces you to slow down. I parked near the old square and sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary. The engine ticked softly as it cooled, a quiet reminder that I didn't have to rush anymore. Not here, not now. The air felt different. Not better or worse, just familiar. Like a song you hadn't heard in years, but somehow still knew every word to. I walked toward the center of town, my footsteps steady, my thoughts less so. With every step, memories rose up gently, not demanding attention, just offering themselves. This was the place where everything had begun, and ended, and begun again in ways I hadn't understood at the time. The square was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had grown. There was a bench near the old oak tree, the same one that had shaded generations of quiet conversations. I sat there, letting the weight of the moment settle. The bark of the tree was rough beneath my fingers, grounding me in something solid and real. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I let myself listen. The distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves overhead, the soft rhythm of life continuing all around me, indifferent to my return, and yet somehow welcoming it. I thought about how long it had taken me to come back, not just physically, but emotionally. For years, I had carried this place with me like unfinished business. Every success I'd achieved elsewhere felt incomplete because it hadn't happened here. Every failure felt heavier because it had begun here. I used to think leaving was the hardest thing I'd ever done. I was wrong. Coming back required more courage. I remembered the version of myself who had once believed that escape was the same as freedom. She had packed her bags with hope and fear, convinced that distance alone could rewrite her story. She had learned, eventually, that distance only amplifies what you refuse to face. I smiled softly at that thought, not with regret, but with understanding. Growth has a way of humbling you. A couple walked past, laughing quietly. I wondered if they knew how lucky they were to belong to a moment without realizing it. Most of us don't. We only recognize meaning in hindsight. The sun shifted, casting longer shadows across the square. Time was moving again, gently reminding me that reflection didn't have to mean stagnation. I stood and continued walking. The house was still there. I knew it would be, but seeing it made my chest tighten all the same. The paint was a different color now. The porch railing had been replaced, but the shape of it, the bones of the place, were unchanged. This was where I had learned the sound of safety and the sound of silence. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. Standing across the street was enough. I let myself remember without stepping back into it completely. There's a difference between honoring the past and living in it. I realized then that the ache I'd expected wasn't there. In its place was something quieter. Acceptance. I had spent years believing closure came from answers, from apologies, from explanations that wrapped everything up neatly. But standing there, I understood something new. Closure comes from permission. Permission to stop carrying what was never yours to hold forever. Permission to let memories exist without defining you. Permission to move forward without resentment toward who you once were. I took a deep breath and felt something shift inside me. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to matter. Enough to feel lighter. As I walked back toward the square, the town no longer felt like a weight. It felt like a chapter that had been read, understood, and finally set down. Not forgotten, just complete. The sky had softened into evening hues, and lights flickered on in windows one by one. I realized I was hungry, not just for food, but for the kind of simple presence I had denied myself for too long. I went back to the diner. Inside, it smelled like coffee and familiarity. A few people glanced up as I entered, their expressions neutral but kind. I took a seat near the window and ordered without thinking, muscle memory guiding the words. As I waited, I watched the world outside continue its quiet rhythm. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was standing outside my own life, observing it from a distance. I was in it, fully, calmly, honestly. The past hadn't disappeared. It had simply loosened its grip. And that, I realized, was enough. Silence does not arrive all at once. It settles slowly, the way dust gathers in a room that has not been opened in a long time. At first, she barely noticed it. Life was still moving. The days still passed. The world outside her windows remained loud and busy, filled with sounds that never asked permission before entering her space. Cars passing, voices drifting, the steady hum of things continuing without her. But inside her home, something had changed. The silence had weight now. She felt it most in the evenings, when the light softened and the edges of the day began to blur. When distractions faded, and there was nowhere left to look except inward. The rooms felt larger then, as if the walls had quietly stepped back, giving her too much space to think. She moved through those rooms slowly, not because she was tired, but because moving too quickly felt wrong, as if the silence might break if she startled it. She found herself listening for sounds that never came. The faint echo of a laugh, the familiar rhythm of another presence, footsteps that once felt ordinary and now felt impossible. Instead, there was only the low murmur of her own breathing. At night, the silence grew heavier. It pressed against her chest when she lay down, making sleep feel like something distant and fragile. She would turn from one side to the other, searching for comfort in familiar positions that no longer brought relief. Her thoughts filled the quiet, They came without warning. Memories rising and falling, looping back on themselves. Moments she had dismissed as small now felt enormous. Conversations replayed in her mind, not as they were, but as they could have been. She wondered how many things had gone unsaid simply because they felt unnecessary at the time. She wondered how often she had assumed there would be more time. There's a particular kind of pain in realizing that silence can carry regret. During the day, she kept herself busy. She cleaned spaces that were already clean, rearranged objects that did not need rearranging. She filled the hours with motion, hoping movement would drown out the quiet that waited patiently underneath everything. But silence is not something you outrun. It follows. It waits. Sometimes it arrived in the smallest moments. Standing in the kitchen, staring at the sink, her hands resting on the counter longer than necessary. Sitting in the car after parking, the engine already off, unsure why she hadn't stepped out yet. In those moments, she felt suspended between what had been and what was still unknown. She realized then that silence was not empty. It was full of questions. Questions without answers. Questions without clear edges. She asked herself whether she had changed, or if she had simply been revealed. Whether the quiet was showing her something she had avoided seeing when life was louder. She thought about how often she had filled her days with noise, mistaking activity for meaning. How silence once felt uncomfortable, something to be avoided rather than understood. Now it demanded her attention. There were days when the weight of it felt unbearable. When she longed for anything, music, conversation, even meaningless sound, just to break the stillness. And then there were days when she welcomed it. Those days surprised her. On those mornings, she would wake early, before the world fully stirred. The silence felt softer then, gentler, less like an absence and more like a pause. She would sit by the window and watch the light change. Notice how the shadows shifted almost imperceptibly, how the sky never looked the same 2 mornings in a row. In those quiet moments, she began to sense something unfamiliar. Clarity. The silence gave her space to hear her own thoughts without interruption. Not the rushed, scattered thoughts of busy days, but the deeper ones, the kind that spoke slowly and carefully. She began to understand that silence was not punishing her, it was inviting her to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge loss without rushing past it, to recognize that grief did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispered. She started writing again, though not with any goal in mind, just small observations, fragments of thought, sentences that did not need to become anything more. The sound of the pen moving across the page became a companion, a reminder that silence did not mean nothing was happening. Something was changing. She noticed it in subtle ways, in how she breathed more deeply, in how she no longer felt the need to fill every moment, in how stillness, once frightening, began to feel almost protective. Silence taught her patience. It taught her that healing was not dramatic, that it did not arrive with grand gestures or clear endings. It unfolded quietly, often unnoticed, until one day she realized she was standing a little straighter, breathing a little easier. She understood then that silence had not taken something from her. It had given her something she had never allowed herself before. Time. Time to feel without judgment. Time to listen without distraction. Time to rebuild herself from the inside out. And as she sat there, wrapped in the quiet of her own making, she knew this chapter of her life was not defined by what had been lost, but by what she was learning to hold. The silence remained, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt honest. Silence does not arrive all at once. It enters slowly, like a tide that pulls back without warning, leaving behind damp ground and unanswered questions. For her, silence began in the early mornings. The house would wake before she did. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, the low whisper of wind moving through the trees outside the window. These sounds had always been there, but now they felt louder, more present, as if they were trying to say something she wasn't yet ready to hear. She would lie still in bed, eyes open, staring at the pale ceiling as the light slowly shifted from gray to gold. The warmth of the blanket no longer felt comforting. It felt heavy, anchoring, as if getting up required more strength than it should. She noticed how her breathing had changed, slower, shallower, measured, like someone carefully stepping across thin ice. There was nothing dramatic about this moment, no crisis. No single thought that demanded attention, just a growing awareness that something inside her had gone quiet. Not empty, quiet. And quiet can be unsettling when you've spent a lifetime filling every space with noise. She had learned early on that silence could be dangerous. Silence meant being overlooked, forgotten. Silence was something to avoid, to cover with productivity, conversation, responsibility. If she stayed busy enough, useful enough, necessary enough, then silence would never catch her. But now, here it was, sitting beside her in the early hours, patient and unafraid. As she eventually rose from bed, she moved through the house without turning on many lights. She wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee, letting the heat seep into her palms, grounding her in something real and physical. Outside, the morning air was cool and clean. The world looked untouched, as if it had not yet decided what kind of day it would become. She stood by the window longer than usual, watching the branches sway. Each movement felt deliberate, unhurried. The trees did not rush. They did not explain themselves. They simply existed. That was when the thought surfaced, not loudly, but clearly. When was the last time I allowed myself to simply exist? The question did not accuse her. It didn't demand an answer. It just hovered there, waiting. Throughout the day, the silence followed her, in small pauses between tasks, in moments when her phone didn't buzz, in the spaces between conversations where she would normally rush to fill the gap. She noticed how uncomfortable those pauses made her, how quickly her mind searched for something to do, something to fix, something to anticipate. It was easier to stay ahead of the feeling than to sit with it. But that evening, something shifted. She took a walk just before dusk, choosing a familiar path through the park. The air smelled faintly of earth and fallen leaves. The sky stretched wide above her, painted in soft blues and fading golds. As she walked, her footsteps fell into a steady rhythm, and with each step, her thoughts slowed. She became aware of how tired she was, not physically, but deeply, in a way that sleep alone could not fix. Tired of explaining herself, tired of proving her worth, tired of carrying expectations that were never truly hers. She paused near a bench, resting her hands on the cool wood, and allowed herself to breathe without trying to shape the breath into anything productive. The silence returned, thicker now, but not heavy. It felt honest. Memories began to surface, uninvited but not unwelcome. Moments she had rushed past in her life. Times when she had ignored her own instincts in favor of being agreeable. When she had chosen stability over truth, familiarity over fulfillment. She saw herself at different ages, each version carrying something forward, without ever setting it down. The silence seemed to ask gently, "What have you been holding for too long?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she listened. Listened to the wind moving through the trees. Listened to the distant sound of traffic, softened by distance. Listened to the subtle shift inside her chest as she acknowledged a truth she had avoided. She had been living on autopilot. Not unhappily, not dramatically unfulfilled, but disconnected from her own needs, from her own voice. That realization did not bring panic. It brought clarity. She understood now why the silence had come. It wasn't there to take something from her. It was there to give her space. Space to notice what mattered. Space to grieve what had been neglected. Space to choose differently, even if she didn't yet know how. As night settled in, she walked home slowly, letting the darkness arrive without resistance. Inside the house, she turned on a single lamp, its warm light casting soft shadows on the walls. She sat at the table without distractions, hands resting in front of her, and allowed the quiet to settle once more. This time, it did not feel threatening. It felt like an invitation. She thought about the days ahead, not with anxiety, but with a cautious sense of possibility. She did not need a plan yet. She did not need answers tonight. All she needed was the courage to remain present long enough to hear what the silence was trying to tell her. And in that stillness, something subtle but powerful began to form. A willingness to listen to herself again. Not the version shaped by expectation or habit, but the quieter voice beneath it all. The one that had been waiting patiently, trusting that eventually she would slow down enough to hear it. The silence did not break. It stayed, and for the first time, she welcomed it. Night arrived quietly, not with thunder, not with warnings, but with a softness that felt almost deceptive. The kind of night that settles gently over the world, as if nothing significant is about to happen at all. Evelyn noticed it first in the way the air felt heavier than usual, as though it carried memories instead of moisture. She sat alone in her living room, the lamps dim, the curtains half drawn, the ticking of the wall clock steady and patient. She had lived in this house for years now, long enough to know every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of wind that slipped through the old window frames. And yet tonight, the house felt unfamiliar, as if it were holding its breath. She folded the blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared at the darkened television screen, seeing not her reflection, but something deeper. A version of herself that had once believed she could outrun the past. The day had been ordinary. Grocery shopping, a short walk, a polite conversation with a neighbor she barely knew. Nothing that should have stirred the quiet ache that now pressed against her chest. And yet here it was. That ache had a way of returning without invitation. Evelyn stood and walked slowly toward the bookshelf near the hallway. She hadn't planned to touch it. In fact, she had avoided this particular shelf for years. But tonight, her hand reached for it without conscious thought. Her fingers brushed against a thin photo album wedged between two novels. She hesitated. There were moments in life when hesitation felt like wisdom, and moments when it felt like fear disguised as patience. Evelyn had learned the difference too late in many chapters of her life. Slowly, she pulled the album free. Dust lifted into the air, catching the lamplight like tiny floating stars. She carried the album to the couch and sat again, resting it on her lap. The cover was faded now, the edges worn soft with time. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she closed her eyes, and memories began to surface, not as images yet, but as feelings. The warmth of a hand she no longer held. The sound of laughter that once filled a room and then vanished. The weight of words that were never spoken when they should have been. When she finally opened the album, the first photograph greeted her like an old friend who had never forgiven her for leaving. There she was, younger, brighter, standing beside a version of life that still felt possible. Evelyn traced the edge of the photo with her fingertip, her breath slowing. She remembered the day it was taken. Not the details, but the certainty she had felt back then. The belief that things would work out simply because she wanted them to. That belief had not survived. She turned the page. Another photo. Another memory. Each one pulled her deeper, unraveling the careful distance she had built between herself and who she used to be. It was strange how time worked. How years could compress into moments when memory decided to speak. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the windows like fingers tapping softly, insistently. Evelyn looked up. For a brief second, she thought she heard something else. A sound layered beneath the wind. A familiar rhythm. Footsteps. Her heart quickened, then steadied itself again. She shook her head gently, almost amused by herself. Old habits, old hopes. She closed the album and rested it beside her. The memories lingered anyway, settling into the room like guests who had no intention of leaving. That was when the knock came. It was quiet, almost polite. 3 soft taps at the front door. Evelyn froze. Time stretched in strange ways in moments like this. Her mind raced ahead while her body remained still, caught between disbelief and instinct. No one ever knocked that late. She stood slowly, the floorboard beneath her feet groaning in protest. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she moved toward the hallway. Each step felt deliberate, heavy with possibility. The knock came again, still gentle, still patient. She stopped a few feet from the door and rested her hand against the wall, steadying herself. Her breath felt shallow now, her chest tight. She told herself to be rational. This was just a visitor, a mistake, a neighbor. And yet deep down, something else stirred, a recognition she hadn't felt in years. She reached for the door handle, paused, and then turned the lock. The door opened to the cool night air, and a figure standing just beyond the porch light's glow. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with years. He looked older. Of course he did. Time had touched him too. Lines at the corners of his eyes, a softness where sharp edges once lived. But it was him. There was no mistaking that. "Evelyn," he said finally, his voice quieter than she remembered. Her name sounded different when spoken by him, like a word from another language she used to speak fluently and had almost forgotten. She didn't answer right away. Her thoughts tangled, emotions colliding, surprise, fear, anger, relief. All of them rising at once. "I didn't know if you'd still be here," he continued, shifting his weight slightly. "I didn't know if you'd open the door." "I almost didn't," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. They stood there, suspended between past and present, neither quite ready to step fully into the moment. Finally, she moved aside. "Come in," she said. He hesitated this time, then stepped inside. The door closed softly behind him, sealing them into the same space. For the first time in years, the house seemed to notice. It felt smaller suddenly, warmer, charged with something unspoken. He glanced around, taking it in. "It looks like you," he said, calm, thoughtful. She gave a faint smile. It took a while to get there. They sat across from each other, the coffee table between them, like a boundary neither was ready to cross. She poured 2 cups of tea without asking. Some habits never left. They spoke carefully at first, about ordinary things, time passing, lives lived apart. But beneath every word was the same question neither had voiced yet. Why now? Eventually, silence returned. Not uncomfortable, just heavy. I didn't come to reopen wounds, he said quietly. I came because I realized something. She looked at him then, really looked at him. What? That some stories don't end when we think they do, he said. They just wait until we're ready to understand them. Evelyn felt something loosen inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. The clock on the wall ticked on, marking the passing seconds. Outside, the wind softened, as if the night itself were listening. For the first time in a long while, Evelyn didn't feel the urge to run from the past. She felt ready to sit with it, to listen, to decide, finally, how the story would continue. The house had learned her footsteps. It recognized the difference between hurry and hesitation, between the quick pace of obligation and the slow movement of thought. That morning, as she crossed the hallway, her steps were quieter than usual, as though even the floorboards understood she was carrying something fragile inside her. She paused near the front door. The light outside was pale, undecided, not quite morning, not quite the soft gray of dawn. It reminded her of the way she felt, caught between leaving and staying, between what had been and what still might be. She rested her hand against the doorframe, not opening it, just feeling the cool wood beneath her palm. There was comfort in its solidity, proof that some things at least stayed where they were placed. For years, this house had been more than shelter. It had been witness. It had heard laughter echo through its rooms, and later, silence stretched so wide it felt like a sound of its own. It had held arguments in its walls and forgiveness in its corners, and now it held her, standing still, unsure of her next step. She had once believed that leaving was the hardest choice a person could make. She was learning that staying, truly staying, required a different kind of courage. She moved into the kitchen and set the kettle on the stove, a habit so ingrained she didn't remember deciding to do it. The sound of water filling the kettle was steady, grounding, ordinary. It reminded her that life didn't always announce its turning points with drama. Sometimes it whispered them into routine moments. As the kettle warmed, she leaned against the counter and let her thoughts wander back. Not to the pain, but to the beginnings. She remembered the early days when staying felt effortless, when the house was new to them and every room seemed full of possibility. They had talked about the future in casual tones, as if it were guaranteed, as if time itself were generous. Back then, staying didn't feel like a decision. It felt like momentum. The kettle began to hum softly, pulling her back to the present. She poured the water carefully, watching steam rise and fade into the air. She didn't rush. There was no reason to. With the mug cradled in her hands, she walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street. A few leaves skittered across the pavement, carried by a wind she couldn't feel from inside. Everything looked calm, unchanged. And yet, she knew better. Change didn't always arrive loudly. Often, it settled in quietly, rearranging the inside of a person while the outside remained the same. She thought about the question that had followed her for weeks now, the one she avoided during the day, but faced at night when sleep refused to come. Why am I still here? It wasn't a question of blame. It wasn't even a question of love. It was deeper than that. She was still there because the leaving she imagined didn't feel like freedom. It felt like loss layered on top of loss. Because staying, painful as it sometimes was, still felt like belonging to something unfinished, rather than abandoning it entirely. She had learned that people often misunderstood staying. They thought it meant weakness, fear, or resignation. But they didn't see the daily effort it took to remain open when closing off would be easier. They didn't see the strength it required to rebuild trust, piece by piece, without any guarantee it would hold. Staying was not passive. It was an active choice, made again and again, even on days when doubt pressed heavily against her ribs. She sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth settle. There was comfort in the simple act of drinking something warm. Comfort in small things that asked nothing of her. Her gaze drifted to the chair near the window, the one she often avoided. It was where conversations had happened, where words had been spoken that could not be taken back, where apologies had come later, imperfect but sincere. She hadn't sat there in a while. After a moment, she carried her mug over and lowered herself into the chair. The wood creaked softly beneath her weight. Familiar and unbothered by her return, she closed her eyes. Staying, she realized, wasn't about clinging to the past. It was about deciding whether the future deserved a chance to be different. Whether growth was possible, not in spite of what had happened, but because of it. She thought of the many versions of herself that had lived in this house. The hopeful one, the hurt one, the angry one, the quiet one who learned to listen more than speak. All of them had left traces behind. All of them had shaped who she was now. And now, this version of her stood at a threshold not marked by doors or distance, but by intention. The future would not be saved by staying alone. It would require honesty, boundaries, conversations that were uncomfortable and slow and necessary. It would require her to remain present, even when it would be easier to retreat into silence. She opened her eyes and looked around the room. Really looked this time. The software on the furniture, the light catching dust in the air, the ordinary beauty of a life that was still unfolding. She realized then that staying did not mean pretending everything was fine. It meant acknowledging that it wasn't, and choosing to face that truth without running. The weight of staying was real. She felt it in her chest, steady and firm. But beneath that weight was something else. Resolve. She finished her tea and stood, rinsing the mug before placing it upside down on the counter. Small acts, done with intention. As she turned away from the sink, she felt it. Not certainty, not yet, but clarity. For today, she would stay. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because she believed that some things, when given time and care, could still become something worth holding. And for now, that belief was enough. The morning arrived without ceremony, the way so many important mornings do. There was no announcement, no sudden clarity, just a pale light stretching across the room, touching the walls gently, as if asking permission to enter. She lay still for a long moment, listening. Not for sounds outside, but for the feeling inside her chest. That subtle weight she had grown used to carrying. It was still there, but different now. Softer, less sharp around the edges. Change, she had learned, rarely felt like victory. More often, it felt like quiet endurance. She rose slowly, letting her feet touch the floor, grounding herself in the simple reality of the moment. The room felt familiar, but not unchanged. Or maybe it was she who had changed, and the room only reflected that truth back to her. The mirror across the room caught her reflection as she passed. She paused, not out of vanity, but out of habit. For years, she had looked at her own face as if searching for someone else, someone stronger, someone braver, someone who had it all figured out. This time, she didn't search. She simply looked. There were lines she didn't remember earning, shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of long nights and longer thoughts. But there was something else too, a steadiness, a presence, as if she had finally arrived in her own life, even if she wasn't sure what came next. The kettle warmed as she moved through the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of routine offering comfort. There was something grounding about repetition, about knowing what came next, even when the future felt uncertain. She carried her mug to the window and stood there, watching the neighborhood wake up. A dog tugged eagerly at its leash. A car engine turned over with reluctance. Someone laughed in the distance. Life continued. It always did. For a long time, she had believed that becoming someone new meant shedding everything she had been before. That growth required erasure. That strength meant never looking back. But standing there, wrapped in the quiet hum of the morning, she understood something differently. She didn't need to abandon her past to move forward. She needed to carry it honestly. The mistakes, the tenderness, the moments she wished she had handled better. The versions of herself that had tried their best with what they knew at the time. They were not burdens. They were proof. Proof that she had lived, that she had felt deeply, that she had endured. As the day unfolded, she moved through it with a new kind of awareness. Not urgency, not fear, just attention. She noticed the way sunlight shifted across the floor, the way her breath slowed when she allowed it, the way her thoughts drifted, no longer racing toward outcomes, but settling into questions instead. What mattered now? Not in the abstract, not in the way people talked about purpose or success or meaning, but in the quiet, personal sense. What mattered to her? The answer didn't come as a list. It came as a feeling, a sense of alignment, of choosing what felt true rather than what looked impressive from the outside. She thought about the years she had spent shrinking herself, smoothing her edges, adjusting her voice to fit rooms that never quite felt like home. She thought about the cost of that kind of survival, and she thought about how tired she had been, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. There was a time when rest felt like something she had to earn, when slowing down felt like failure, when stillness frightened her because it left too much space for reflection. Now stillness felt like permission. Later, as the afternoon softened into evening, she found herself walking without a destination. The air was cooler, carrying the scent of leaves and distant rain. Each step felt intentional, even though she wasn't trying to go anywhere specific. She realized then that becoming wasn't about arriving at a final version of herself. It was about learning how to stay present during the unfolding. There would be days ahead that tested her, days when old habits returned, days when doubt crept in quietly, pretending to be reason. But there would also be days like this, days when she trusted herself enough to pause, to listen, to choose gently. She stopped at the edge of the path and looked up at the sky, the colors fading slowly into dusk. There was no grand revelation, no sudden promise of ease, just a calm acceptance. She was still learning, still growing, still becoming, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The quiet weight she carried was no longer just heaviness. It had become substance, meaning. A reminder that transformation didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, and sometimes that whisper was stronger than any shout. Some truths don't arrive suddenly. They rise slowly, like fog lifting from a field at dawn. For years, she had believed that the past was something finished, sealed away, quiet and settled. But as she sat alone that evening, the house breathing softly around her, she realized how wrong she had been. The past was not gone. It had simply been patient. She stood near the window, watching the last light stretch thin across the yard. The world outside looked peaceful, almost forgiving. Inside her, memories pressed gently, insistently, asking to be acknowledged. She thought about the choices she had made, not just the loud ones, but the quiet ones, the times she stayed silent, the moments she walked away when she might have stayed. The years she convinced herself that endurance was the same as strength. It had taken her a lifetime to understand the difference. As a younger woman, she believed survival meant holding on. Now she knew survival sometimes meant letting go. She remembered the version of herself who once thought love required sacrifice without limit. That woman had believed pain was proof of loyalty. That patience could fix what honesty never touched. She closed her eyes and let the truth surface at last. She had been afraid, not of others, but of herself. Afraid of wanting more, afraid of asking for peace, afraid of becoming someone unfamiliar. And so she had stayed, in places, in roles, in stories that no longer fit her. The realization did not arrive with regret. It arrived with clarity. She breathed deeply, as if making room for the truth to finally sit beside her without judgment. That night, she did not cry. She did not reach for distractions. She simply allowed herself to see her life clearly, not as a series of failures or mistakes, but as a long education. Every chapter had taught her something, even the hardest ones, especially the hardest ones. Change does not always announce itself. Sometimes it enters quietly, in small decisions made without witnesses. Following the next morning, she woke earlier than usual, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The house was still wrapped in silence, the kind that feels safe rather than empty. She made her coffee slowly, deliberately, savoring the ordinary ritual. For the first time in a long while, the day ahead did not feel heavy with expectation. There was no one to impress, no one to appease, no role she needed to perform, only herself. She began making subtle changes, not dramatic ones, nothing that would alarm those around her, but meaningful ones. She said no more often. She spoke honestly when it mattered. She stopped explaining herself to people who had never truly listened. She spent time alone, without calling it loneliness. She rested without guilt. She allowed silence to be full instead of frightening. And slowly, something shifted. Her life did not become perfect, but it became hers. She noticed how her body felt lighter when she stopped carrying emotional weight that was never meant to be hers. How her thoughts softened when she no longer rehearsed conversations that would never happen. She discovered that peace was not a reward for suffering. It was a choice. Each day, she rewrote herself just a little, not by erasing the past, but by refusing to let it dictate the future. And for the first time, the story she was living felt aligned with the woman she had become. People noticed the change before she did. They commented on her calm, on the way she listened without absorbing, on how she no longer rushed to fill every silence. Some were drawn closer by this new steadiness. Others drifted away, unsettled by the boundaries she now held with ease. She understood both reactions. Growth, she had learned, does not always make you more lovable, but it makes you more real. There were moments when old doubts resurfaced, moments when she wondered if peace was temporary, if the past would reclaim her when she least expected it. But now she knew how to meet those moments. She met them with patience, with perspective, with compassion for the woman she had once been. She no longer fought her memories. She acknowledged them and then let them pass. The world did not change overnight, but her relationship with it did, and that changed everything. There is a moment in every life when understanding settles fully, not in the mind, but in the body. For her, it came on an ordinary evening. She sat quietly, a soft lamp glowing nearby, the room wrapped in gentle warmth. Outside, night had fallen without ceremony. Inside, something finally came to rest. She realized she was no longer waiting, not for permission, not for validation, not for an ending or a beginning. She was simply present. The hearthlight did not symbolize rescue or transformation. It symbolized constancy, the steady warmth that remains when everything else has changed. She smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because she was whole. Her story did not end there. Stories never truly do, but it reached a place of peace. And that was enough. If you're listening to this now, know this. Your life is not behind you. It is not wasted. It is not defined by what you endured. You are allowed to change, quietly, slowly, without apology. You are allowed to step into peace without proving you deserve it. Let the hearthlight find you, too.
Thank you for spending this time with us. I truly hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, ideas, or suggestions for future stories, feel free to share them in the comments below. Your thoughts mean a lot to us. If this journey warmed your heart, don't forget to like the video and share it with someone who loves stories like these. And to continue exploring new tales and adventures, subscribe to Hearthlight Saga. Until next time, may your days be filled with light and wonder.